Good afternoon, perhaps good morning. It's a real pleasure to be able to share with you some of my thoughts, although I would have been much happier to be in Belo Horizonte, facing an audience of friends, colleagues, and experts from around the world, rather than here on the 38th day of a lockdown in Paris. The FAUBAI president and director asked me to make some comments about the future of international higher education. And I find it very risky and difficult to crystal ball gaze at this time. None of us could have imagined the reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is unprecedented, and it has a global impact like perhaps nothing else before it. Still, we're learning every day about the consequences of this crisis, and so predicting the future is even more difficult. So my comments are more of a personal nature based on my convictions and my values rather than an expert researched scenario planning exercise. I'd like to underline that we also have to be very careful about what we mean by the future. We need both to look at the immediate and the short term, as many of the institutions around the world have been doing, as well as the medium to long term. And in each case, we need to think about what measures are sustainable in the long run. For example, the lockdowns that we are experiencing, including university closures, may have brought a level of health security, but they're not sustainable. So measures to reopen and how to reopen are preoccupying all higher education leaders and managers at the moment. Going back to business as usual may be a long-term goal, but it is unlikely for a long time, and it may indeed be undesirable. For example, the overwhelming dependence on international students for revenues and to simply fill our classrooms is not sustainable, and this crisis may make it so visible that we will not return to the past. I'd also like to say that in the future, the international dimension of higher education will not be able to be discussed without looking at overall higher education planning. We've argued for many years that internationalization is no longer marginal. Well, I think this crisis and its aftermath will make this integration even more important. In the short term, for example, a lockdown on international mobility is necessary, but the consequences are going to be felt, and the impact will be felt on every aspect of institutional planning: financial, research, physical, the need for classroom space, etc. In the medium and long term, is a massive reduction of mobility sustainable? What alternatives for ensuring there is an international dimension to our learning can we offer? How will lacking capacity or opportunity be met in some parts of the world? And how will some laboratories in other parts of the world continue to function without international students? And finally, how will we achieve the international exposure that mobility and hosting international students bring to our higher education institutions? All of these questions will need to be addressed in different ways. Higher education strategies will need to encompass fully the international dimension in terms of financial and academic and socio-cultural terms. The past weeks have shown the potential of technology and virtual learning as indispensable tools, even if they remain challenging in some parts of the countries and for many. They hold part of the solution, but not all of it. For internationalization, at least part of its future may lie in its recent history. Half a century ago, the focus in international education was not so much on mobility and the economic gains to be gained from this modality. It was more about learning about other models, learning from others, learning languages, gaining cultural competencies, and intercultural understanding. International cooperation and capacity building for solidarity between nations was a priority. In the future, international education might need to refocus on the content, on curriculum, and invent new or reinvent certain modalities that rely less on face-to-face physical mass mobility. Building local capacity rather than relying on the provision elsewhere may need to become a much higher priority for states, for countries, as well as for institutions. The pandemic revealed or underlined a number of critical issues. It lifted the cover on a huge socioeconomic disparities, both within and between countries, and how limited access to higher education exacerbates both of these. It underlined important cultural differences between peoples and nations based on different value systems. This was very clear in the way people in different parts of the world react to the right to privacy, linked to tracking, how collective versus individual rights to freedom is being viewed in some parts of the world. And their impact, these differences and their impact on day-to-day life and crisis management have never been so clear. The pandemic shined a new light on differences in political and economic regimes, democracy versus authoritarianism, welfare state, or hyper-capitalist regimes, the limits of economic and political globalization. It undermined the trust in multilateral organizations in some nations and in regional institutions, and even in bilateral relations when facing threat. These will all be critical issues for higher education to address at home and in their international relations and work, in research, in education, in outreach. This crisis demonstrates how vulnerable humanity is despite modern science and despite technological prowess. But it also shows how resourceful it is. In the short term, and despite the numerous unknowns, the faith in scientific research, not only in the health sector, has gained tremendously. Universities have shown innovative ways in which technology can serve basic needs, and students are taking part in all of these innovations. It also brought to light the dark side of our interconnectivity, our cooperation and networking. Some of that networking in pursuit of our internationalization agenda. We are learning that much can be done without hopping on a plane, that social media can be extremely useful to mobilize goodwill, generate ideas for numerous support services, and to share the learning. We are all learning how unprepared we are to help the most vulnerable in general, but also those very close to us, our students. We saw many students become cut off from their resources, left without means of support, and often far from home. The responses had to be invented quickly and are still being adapted today. One of the certain things that can be said about the future of higher education and of internationalization is that it will not be the same. My personal conviction is that the future of higher education and its international dimension must be anchored even more strongly in social responsibility. Experts are drawing links between the viral pandemic and the unsustainable manner in which we exploit our natural resources. So higher education and research efforts in the area of sustainable development must continue and in fact be reinforced. And this cannot be achieved without deep appreciation and understanding of the international dimension of all issues. So internationalization remains essential. We are all suffering from the pandemic. It is global. We are in this together. Yes, yet collaboration across differences may be more difficult to achieve unless this is made a clear goal. International cooperation in higher education must remain central. Around the world, we are living in real time a massive global experiment in so many regards. A successful outcome will require scientists in all disciplines and in all parts of the world to reflect on both response and prevention approaches. Implement international collaboration, communication, and mutual learning for students, faculty must be sustained, yet we will need to invent many alternative modes so that we rely less on face-to-face meetings. At the same time, the kinds of ties, long-term partnerships and friendships that come from personal encounters and personal experiences overseas, and gatherings such as FAUBAI should have been and will one day be, are indispensable, and I hope that such meetings will be possible soon again, perhaps less frequently. We will cherish them all the more and make sure that they are as productive as possible. Thank you, and stay healthy.